let's get started. Kia ora everyone, ko Sylvie Pukuinga no Tamaki Makoto Waho. Hi everyone, my name's Sylvie. I'm based in Auckland, which is where I think many of you are coming from today. And I'm the HR expert and chief evangelist for My HR, which is certainly the coolest job title I've ever had. I've been with the business 8 years now, and my role is to be a credible voice of HR expertise and sharing knowledge and resources with our clients and with the markets so that people know who we are and what it is that we're about. So today's webinar, as I'm sure you know, is all about restructuring. So we'll talk about organisational design, we'll talk about building a business case, and we'll talk about the nitty-gritty of managing a restructure process from start to finish, and of course finish off at survivor management. Now, restructuring is certainly in the news a lot at the moment. Our colleagues, friends and family down in Wellington are having a bit of a tough time of it with the government cuts. I think the last I saw stuff had counted up to 3,000 jobs were going from the public sector, so it's certainly getting a lot of media attention at the moment. If that's you or your whānau or your friends, it can be an incredibly stressful time, so I hope that you've got good support around you and that you're reaching out as you need and making use of your tools to take care of yourself and make sure that you're operating and living sustainably during a challenging time. So what I'm going to do is just quickly share my screen with you, and then we'll get stuck into today's webinar. Bear with me while I get my text set up. And I'm just going to move this onto the right screen, and then we'll kick off. Cool. So the first thing we'll do is talk a little bit about what we're going to cover off today, which I just blasted through quite quickly, but to give you a bit more detail, we'll talk a little bit about the headwinds that we're experiencing in the economy at the moment, certainly a lot of which are affecting choices that we're seeing in the client base that we support. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about organisational design because it informs the fundamental practice that you are engaging in often when you're restructuring with moving people or roles or tasks around your business. So we'll spend a little bit of time there. We'll then get into the nitty-gritty of running a restructure, looking at the communications you have to send, what information you have to provide, how much time you might need to provide your employees, all that kind of good stuff. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about survivor management. This is an area of restructuring that, in our experience, often gets neglected, particularly with small to medium businesses where you might not have the resources of the Ministry for Social Development or the Warehouse or ANZ, for example. We'll finish off with questions, as we always do. These sessions really do come alive when there's a lot of audience engagement. So if there's anything that you would like to understand in more detail, perhaps you've got a question about something that you are experiencing or you have experienced, feel free to pop it into the Q&A function as we go through the webinar. What I will do is hold all questions to the end, just because we might cover off what it is you're asking about, but we just haven't got there yet. So whether you have questions as we go through, or if it's something you want to hold to the end, that's totally fine. The plan is to go to about 1:40 and then have 15 to 20 minutes for questions, and then get everyone out of here on time for 2 o'clock to get into the rest of our days. So before we get started, if you don't know who My HR is or haven't seen us around before, we were established in 2013 with the goal of making HR easy. So we're an outsourced HR provider covering all employment law matters, from the cool stuff like performance reviews and good onboarding and company policies and remuneration and L&D, all the way through to what I think of as the pointy end of HR, which are things like disciplinaries, trial period terminations, probation period terminations, restructuring, which is the topic today, termination for medical incapacity, all that kind of stuff. So we run the full gamut of what it is that an HR service can provide. The way that we do this is a bit unusual. So we have HR people like me with various backgrounds. We've got people from corporates, we've got people from family-owned businesses, we've got a team who've got some international experience. So there's a bunch of real live HR humans behind the scenes to bounce ideas off, help guide you through processes, write your documents, and generally help make HR a less intimidating place to operate. And we combine that with smart HR software. So the platform is the bridge between yourself and your HR team in the background. It's where all of your people data lives, so it's your digital filing cabinet. It's where processes like performance management or performance reviews and again onboarding live, and it acts as a place where you can store all of your people data. It's your one-stop shop for truth, and also integrates with payroll, ATS, and a number of other providers as well. We're very proud to now have over 1,300 Kiwi and Australian employers, and we launched in Canada at the start of April, which was incredibly exciting. We've had 6 beta clients convert to paying customers, so we're now a proper live Canadian business, which is super dope. It's a really exciting story and really cool to have been a part of. And our clients, again, just cover everything from 1 employee to 750 staff is about the largest customer that we have. Our employer with 1 employee, he likes to cross his T's and dot his I's, which is why we're in there. And some of the brands that you might recognise include Resine, How Pizza, World Wildlife Fund, the Warriors, who were having an amazing season last year and have had a bit of a road bump the last couple of weeks, but we're sure that they'll improve. And again, all industries, all regions. We've got offices in Auckland, Christchurch, Sydney, and Vancouver. So our spread is pretty comprehensive. The way the business model works is that it's paid per head count. So in April, you might call us 60 times because you've got questions about Easter. Maybe you're running a disciplinary, you're considering running a restructure for your sales team because there's been some underperformance there. Your fee remains the same as it will in May when you might only call us twice because you've got 1 question about a piece of software, but there's nothing in particular that we need to do with you. So it's a smooth cost based on headcount. As your business grows and shrinks, your fee grows and shrinks too. So if you do have any questions about the platform, if you'd like a demo or if you want to have a conversation with me afterwards, just drop me through a note and myself or one of our sales team will be in touch for a bit of a chat. Now that I've kept my sales and marketing team happy, let's dive into it today and talk about a little bit of housekeeping. So as always, please keep today's discussions confidential. There might be examples that I will use, which I will anonymize, of course, but just in terms of bringing the conversation to life, there's some stuff that I might share, which I don't want to see on TikTok. So if I see it posted there, I will come and hunt you down and have a conversation with you. And again, questions are welcome, pop them in the Q&A box, and as we go through, I'll collect them all and answer them towards the end. There is a bit of a content warning in here just because we will talk a little bit about bullying and harassment very, very briefly, but as an HR person, of course, I love content warnings, and so if that's going to be uncomfortable for anyone to hear or talk about, you are super welcome to take a break, come back in later, and then we'll go from there. Slides and a recording will be available after the session. So if you have to duck out for whatever reason, or if you need to take a phone call, or if your internet cuts out, you will have access to the resources later on, and the recording will be sent around to you in an email about 2 days' time from now. So probably Thursday morning, you'll get an email with access to the recording if you need it. Let's dive in. So when we talk about restructuring, it's really hard to divorce the process from the context. So in New Zealand at the moment, there are several economic conditions that are making life a bit harder for small and medium-sized operators. And so we'll run through them briefly and then jump into talking about organizational design and what we can do about it. So all in the news yesterday and today has been some really low consumer confidence survey data coming back. The ANZ Roy Morgan poll, which they publish monthly, put consumer confidence at 82.1. That's above consumer confidence levels in the pandemic, but quite close to the lows of consumer confidence we saw during the global financial crisis in 2009, which is never something you want to have in a sentence comparing how people feel today with how people felt in 2009. So certainly there's reduced consumer spending. We're hearing stories about certainly lots of insolvencies and closures in the construction industry. Retail's having a tough time and has for a while. So there's a lot happening at the moment. That means that the cash flow circulating around the economy is slowing down. And if your business is experiencing that, you're certainly not alone. It's not a new problem, it's an economy problem at the moment. We're also seeing at the same time increasing labour costs. So from 2017 to 2024, the minimum wage increased by 47%. I have worked in HR all of that time. I work with these figures most days, and even I was surprised to see what the percentage increase in the minimum wage has been. It's certainly not always a rising tide lifts all boats, but if you've got staff in your business who were earning, 50% above what their minimum wage colleagues were earning 7 years ago, and now they're earning the same, not unreasonably, they're also going to be looking for increases in their remuneration to reflect the value that they bring to the business. So that's putting some upwards pressure on costs as well. Again, cost of living has been in the news for 2.5, 3 years now. It's certainly not going away anytime soon. For the March 24 year, so the 12 months going back from March 2024, there's been a 4% increase in the consumer price index. So the cost of goods, it costs 4% more to buy a gallon of milk, pay for your rent, cover your transport costs on average across that time. Obviously, some things have had different increases than others. But again, this is driving certainly interests in wage increases and a demand for better paying roles from labour, from employees, which again is just combining with that minimum wage piece to put an upward pressure on the cost of labour. We're also seeing low unemployment at 4% for the December 2023 quarter. We don't have figures for the 2024 quarter one just yet, but we know that it was at 3.4% about a year ago. So that is improving in terms of there are more warm bodies in the economy who are looking for work. Certainly the improvement in our immigration figures with people coming in from overseas is affecting that as well. So it's not as hard as it was to find skilled labour or labour at all as it was a year or so ago, but certainly still something to keep an eye on if you're having a hard time finding skilled people to bring into your business. And this is not an acute pressure, but certainly our population demographics are changing. And I think over the next 15 to 20 years in particular, there are going to need to be some structural solutions to the ageing population that New Zealand is experiencing, which is not dissimilar to pressures being faced by other OECD countries as well. So to give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about here, today, when we talk about workers aged under 65 and workers aged over 65, I'm not arbitrarily picking on 65-year-olds, of course, that's when the super kicks in. So we have a lot of data about kind of under 65s and over 65s. For every one worker who's over 65, we have 4 workers under 65. So 20% of our workforce is made up of people who are over 65. In 20 years, that ratio is going to drop to 2 to 1. So instead of having 20% of our workforce be aged over 65, it'll be about a third of our workforce is aged over 65. Again, not an acute pressure, we're talking 2 decades out. But when we think about roles that require characteristics of employees who might not match up with people who are over 65, if you're thinking about intensive physical labour, if you're thinking about the need to learn new products and new technology extremely quickly, that's typically something that younger folk have more experience in. We all kind of calcify as we get older, but certainly younger people tend to be a bit more comfortable learning new things. It might be worth thinking about how you're planning on tackling these changing demographics in your business. If you're a professional services provider, it might not make a massive difference immediately, but certainly when we think about things like there being less parental leave to manage because we have fewer workers of childbearing age than we do now. We might think about more flexible working arrangements because our older generation might be more interested in spending time, with grandchildren or on hobbies or kind of tapering off their hours as they get towards retirement. There will be some changes in the way that we work and the way that we think about work, which might be something for us to certainly just kind of have in the back of your mind over the next little while. So a word on employment relations before we begin, and this is what I like to call the vibe check, so you know the tone of the conversation we're going to be having today. So you can do whatever you want in employment relations. Just like I was driving 58 kilometers per hour in a 50k zone yesterday, I can choose to ignore the speed limit if I want to. And again, in employment relations, you can choose not to follow these processes. You can choose to do whatever it is you want with your workers, but you can't avoid the risk of consequences. So when we talk about processes or about procedures or about things that you must do to minimize risk, what we're doing are describing general principles of how you should operate as a business if you want to reduce the risk of personal grievances, expensive payouts, kind of bad reputation, word of mouth, finding it hard to hire employees. Some of those principles to give you a heads up or choices you might be making as you navigate challenging people times in your business, being pragmatic versus being very straight and narrow. So a straight and narrow decision would be to follow a restructure process exactly start to finish, no deviation in the process, giving people plenty of time at every step to consider what's in front of them, and maybe that would take you 3.5, 4 months to work through if you were running it that way. Now, making pragmatic choices mean your risk is slightly higher, but you're probably going to get better business outcomes. One example of that is often the time that we allow our employees to consult on the information we're presenting to them. This might mean that instead of giving someone 2 weeks to review every single stage of the process, you might be giving them 3 to 5 business days, depending on the complexity of what it is you're putting in front of them. That's not illegal. It's totally fine to give people what counts as fair and reasonable time to review what's in front of them. 2 weeks and 2 days are not written anywhere in law as requirements or things to avoid. But in that case, you're prioritizing the time it takes to move through the process instead of running a perfectly straight, narrow start to finish process that is going to be incredibly easy to defend, but it might leave you worse off in terms of time and therefore cost and so on. Again, if you're a smaller business, it is going to be harder for you to match those legal requirements set out in a perfect, absolutely no fault kind of way. If there's 10 of you in a business, then it's going to be unlikely that you have the resources again of a warehouse or a BNZ or a large government agency. And so you're going to have to make some choices around what's reasonable for you to manage with the resources and the timing and the cash that you have on hand. When it comes to internal policies and decision-making, again, you might want to have in mind too what it is that you've committed to your employees. Decision-making internally can be a bit tricky, especially if often as business owners, we're in the business, right? So choices that we're making about other people's employment inevitably affects our own. So rather than having to have a impartial decision-making, you might just need to have someone internal. And again, you might be choosing to perfectly comply with all of the employment relations requirements, or you might choose to move quickly and at pace because that's what the business requires. So I'm never going to tell you can't do something. Our role is just to give you a sense of the risk that you're taking if someone was to raise a personal grievance or challenge you on a process. But it's your business. You can choose to do whatever you want, but what you can't do is avoid the risk of consequences. So hopefully on a somewhat liberating note, let's jump into organisation design and talk about what this process is and how you might want to build it into your business. So org design sounds really dry. It's the process of designing the job structure of your business or your organisation and the tasks and responsibilities which fit into those roles. And it's one of my kind of favourite aspects of HR is designing the job structure of a business or the org structure to match what's needed. But certainly it's not everyone's favourite. And when we talk about it on paper, it can sound very sterile and certainly very flat. So a key point to make here is that org design happens whether you pay attention to it or not. Every time you choose who in your business is going to lead a new project, every time you hire for someone into a role that is different to what their predecessor had, every time you decide to stop doing something and focus your efforts on something else, every time you decide to hire a new salesperson instead of a new marketer, you're making choices about the design of your organization. Which means it's relevant at all stages and all sizes, right? So if you're a small business, it's incredibly critical that you get this right, because if you have a business of 15 people and 2 of those jobs are not exactly what you need at that point in time, that's a massive percentage of your workforce, which is now not contributing and not offering anything useful. Medium and large organizations have to be really thoughtful about their design because they're managing work across so many more individual contributors, and therefore having org design which is effectively set up to manage at scale is important, because otherwise the economies of scale mean that their wastage and their kind of inaccuracies can be massive. And it also matters at whatever stage of the business you are. If you're downsizing, you have to choose what's critical to keep and to manage. If you're a stable business and you're just kind of doing business as usual, whether you have your org structure set up correctly or incorrectly can maximize or minimize kind of your profitability and your cash flow. And of course, if you're growing, you have to decide where to deploy your cash and your resources to get the best people into the business to support you as you grow. So running quickly through some red flags here. Here are some signs that your org design may need some attention. This is certainly not the only reason that you would want to kick off a restructure, but it's something to bear in mind if you are seeing some of these in your business or your organization at the moment. So the first is that strategic progress is slow or non-existent. If you always find yourself being caught up in the weeds of doing the doing and not having time to engage in kind of your big rocks or your kind of big projects that need taken care of, potentially you don't have your resourcing quite right and that you don't have enough people at the strategic level to push those projects along. If you have unclear internal expectations, maybe areas of responsibility overlap, you've got people protecting their patch or protecting their territory because it's not quite clear what they're all responsible for. Again, a sign that you maybe don't have the clearest structure in terms of what Sylvie's responsible, what Sean's responsible for, what Ashley's responsible for, and so on. High reactivity and low responsiveness, again, can be a signal of your org structure not being quite right. If you have lots of people who are focused on, again, the doing of the doing, you won't have enough people kind of looking ahead to see what the risks are that might be coming up. If there's going to be some changes in Q3 with export rules to Canada, that might mean that you have to change the way your packaging is handled. Any of that kind of stuff is not going to be taken care of or caught because your team is so focused on the day-to-day and potentially there's a structure issue there, excuse me. Workload consistently being unbalanced is one that comes up a bit. And this could be if someone has, sweet FA to do, if they're just cruising all the time and don't have enough to keep them busy, maybe a sign that role's not super critical. Again, not as much of a problem in small business as the other end of the scale where we have people who are consistently overworked, can't take annual leave. When they're sick, they can't take time away from work because there's no one to cover them. So if you have your workload unbalanced in either direction, it might be a sign you need to pay attention to your resourcing. If you dread the thought of recruiting, it might be because recruiting is a pain in the neck and it's an art, not a science, and can lead to really disappointing outcomes. So certainly, again, that's not the only reason you would dread it. But if it's really hard to explain to people the work that they're going to be doing, if it's really hard to narrow down the skill set that you need to do the work that's most important, potentially you haven't thought clearly or strategically or tactically enough about the job and about what it is that you're asking this person to do. So recruiting is made a lot easier where you have really clear job descriptions, really clear outcomes you're looking for, and therefore can clearly recruit for the skill set that you need, and also explain clearly to someone what it is that they can expect when they come into the role. Again, for employees who are within the business, you might be being held hostage by people who do have really high specialist or institutional knowledge. This tends to happen where you have people who've been around a very, very long time and feel like they're irreplaceable, or where you haven't designed your succession planning or your bench strength enough to be able to cover for someone who's critical but might be an asshole. Maybe they command a really, really high fee or a really high salary because you're worried about having to go and recruit for them. Any of those indicators might be a sign that your structure needs some attention. This can lead to needing to untangle awkward employment relationships. So if you sign someone up to the business on the understanding that they would be in a really senior strategic role, and they get there and figure out that it's actually lots of being in the weeds, very tactical, very hands-on, it's unlikely they're going to stick around for a long time. Likewise, if you go to market not really knowing what you need, and you meet Sylvie and she's sparky and does all these webinars and that's super cool, you might be inclined to bring her into the business because she seems like a good egg and you get on really well and you think that she's got some good work to offer. But if you bring her into the business and it turns out that what you need isn't a sparky extrovert, you actually need a methodical, process-oriented, kind of detail-oriented person. Suddenly, Sylvie's not done anything wrong, but the skill and the mindset that you need and the experience you need are not what you paid for. And so now you might need to go through a trial or a probation period termination or a restructure, nothing to do with the fault of the person, but just because the structure wasn't highly organised. And lastly, your expenditure on temps and contractors might be quite high. So if you don't have the skill and the capability in the business, you often tend to go and try and find it elsewhere. So when thinking about your org design, start at the top and work your way down. Your strategy has to be served by the jobs that you have, which have to be performed effectively by the people that you have. So starting with people is not going to get you the outcome that you want. Start with where you're heading, and then you can plot a course there with the jobs and the work and the skills that you need. So strategy, think about what are your goals, what choices have you made about achieving those goals. Understand what work is required. We're talking about tasks here. What needs to happen to achieve your goals, and therefore what tasks need to be done. Those then get broken into your jobs or your roles. How does it make sense to group these tasks and activities? Do I need a salesperson who's also really good at customer service? That's going to be a bit tricky to find because the skills needed for sales and customer service are quite different. Does it make sense to split those tasks into a sales role and a customer service role, for example? And then you get to people. It's a bit antithetical for an HR person to say people come last, but certainly in the process of org design, people do need to come last because they are the last piece of the puzzle which supports the structure that you have built, which is going to help you achieve your goals and what you need. So more broadly, separate to restructuring, where do you go from here with org design? So my recommendation is almost always to prioritize these design questions and whatever your regular business management cadences are. So ask, are there enough doing roles to meet our customers' needs? Do we have enough baristas, mechanics, hairdressers, what else might you have? Bookmakers, content writers to actually do the doing of the work that our customers are looking for? Do we have enough coordinating roles to make sure work happens consistently and effectively? So these are your team leader, quality manager, coordinator type roles. We have enough supporting roles to make sure the business is running smoothly. And these are the roles of finance, kind of sales, marketing, HR, all that kind of stuff. And then lastly, are there enough thinking and leading roles to make sure everyone is pulling in the same direction? So your GMs, your regional managers, your C-suites, and so on. So having blasted through that content, let's get into the process of running a restructure start to finish. The org design content, I hope will make a little bit of sense once we've got further into this. But again, if you have any questions, pop them through and I will pick up with you at the end of the webinar. So let's define what it is that we're talking about. So a restructure is a generic name for different processes, but they're all to do with change, right? You've got a structure and then you're restructuring it for whatever reason or for whatever purpose. So this might be financial restructuring. If you are buying a new house, you might be restructuring your mortgage. So you've got a large chunk that's on principal and interest payments and perhaps some on a revolving credit facility. In the business sense, again, if you're switching banks, if you're getting different loans, getting different overdrafts, all of that is part of financial restructuring. Or a company reorganization might be about changing your entities, kind of moving work and liabilities and profit centers around to best meet the needs of the business. In HR, unsurprisingly, a restructure is about potential changes to the T's and C's of your employees. So whether that's changing their pay, whether it's changing their hours, changing their jobs, reducing headcount, reducing cost, anything that affects your employees' T's and C's often has to go through a consultation process of some kind, and we'll talk about what does and doesn't meet that criteria in a little bit. So when we start a restructure process, the purpose is to meet your obligations under law to consult with your employees. It's commonly thought of as resulting in redundancy or fewer positions, but doesn't always have to. Probably, I would say maybe 15 to 20% of the restructures we support clients with don't result in changed and reduced headcount. It's just about shuffling work around and making things a bit different. And of course, it can involve one employee or it might involve thousands, depending on the scale of your business. So situations where you might consider restructuring can be anything that requires the business to be different, basically. So the first and foremost would be the financial pressure. And again, that's what we're seeing with the government requiring cuts to the expenditure of the public service. So today runs a retail store with reduced foot traffic and revenue. Today might be considering reducing the headcount of their retail assistants. Previously they had 5 and now they only need 3 because they're not as busy as they were. And so therefore their revenue has dropped, but also the need for employees has changed. Perhaps there's been a strategic change. So Sanjeev might lead a not-for-profit that is trying something new for their clients. So previously, if they were only about reactive support, perhaps they might be trying to do something more proactive. And so they need different types of skills and roles in the business because previously they had reactive kind of bottom of the cliff support for their clients. And now they need something a bit more proactive at the top of the cliff. Sometimes there are tech improvements. So if Ruby is the team lead for a marketing agency who is now using AI to reduce their workloads, perhaps by cutting down the time it takes to write copy, potentially they can now reduce headcount because they don't need as many copywriters. It's not that there is any financial pressure to, but they found an easier or new way of doing things, and so they're reducing the headcount accordingly. Or it might be growth. So if Vibeke has raised capital and is preparing her team to scale rapidly, perhaps she now has a product, she needs to shrink her R&D department and grow her sales and marketing department because they've got their bare bones in place of what it is that they're selling, and now they're prepared to ramp and get much more revenue and much more market share. Whatever your reason, you do need to prepare a business case for changes, and here we'll talk about what you need to do beforehand with some tips to think about in terms of telling the story. So a business case is your short story about why you're making these changes, right? So start off by describing what the status quo is, explain what has changed. That might be a cash flow issue, it might be profitability, it might be a new strategic direction, and explain what you've already done to try and address this change. If it's cash flow, perhaps you have been reducing your discretionary spend, perhaps you've cut your marketing budget, perhaps you've let a bunch of contractors go. Any of that kind of stuff will show that you have tried to resolve the problem or address the situation before jumping to restructuring. Once you've explained what you've done already, then outline the planned changes and what you're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to develop your bench strength in a sales and marketing team in preparation for growth, explain that. If you're trying to reduce your costs by $200,000 to match your drop in revenue, explain that that's what you're trying to do to get there. Whether it's a return to profitability, a new strategy, or so on, be clear what it is that you're proposing and what it is you're trying to achieve with those changes that you're making. Whatever the reason, we do need to make sure that we're acting in good faith during the process. And this is where we start to get into your legal obligations to manage risk to the business, not just about achieving better outcomes in service of a new strategy or a new direction or reduced revenue, whatever you have. So the overarching principle at play here, as it is in so many of the HR processes that we run, is acting in good faith. So good faith is defined in the Employment Relations Act, and especially in this context, we're looking at Section 4. So good faith requires an employer who is proposing to make a decision that will or is likely to have an adverse effect on the continuation of employment of one or more of their employees to provide the employees affected with some information. The first of these is information relevant to the continuation of the employee's employment about the decision, and then also giving them an opportunity to comment on the information to their employer before the decision is made. Now, this is where a lot of businesses, particularly from the US and Australia, get things wrong. They don't have the same legal obligations to consult before a decision is made. They can make all of the decisions in the background, come to their employees and say, here, this is what this means for you. In New Zealand, we have to consult before we make choices. So if you're considering bringing in a piece of equipment in your factory that you know is going to reduce the headcount of your employees, you actually are required to consult on that change before it's made, because they have a right to comment on the reasons for bringing in the equipment, share their perspective with you and have that perspective heard. So a few more principles. Make sure you design your process in service of the purpose. Again, we're not telling you to follow a process or a set of steps because we like a process. I mean, HR people do like documentation, but it's always in service of an outcome, right? So your process must be commercially justified. Again, you must have that business case. It must be about the work or the role and not about the person. So if you have someone who is underperforming or who doesn't have the right skill set to do their current job, the way that you need to manage that is actually through performance management processes, not through restructuring. Again, all information relevant to the decision must be provided to the affected employees, with few exceptions. Commercially sensitive information does need to be provided. You can't kind of hide your books and say, we've lost 200 grand, therefore we need to save 200 grand. Some evidence of that is required. Your employees must have a fair and reasonable time to seek advice and prepare a response. Again, this might be anything from 3 working days to 10 working days, depending on the circumstances of the employee and the complexity of the proposal you're putting to them. And again, a decision must not be made until you've heard and considered their feedback. So let's run through that in terms of steps and see what that looks like from a process point of view. So stage 1 is to document your business case, write the story, gather supporting information, and outline proposed changes. You'll then need to notify your employees of the proposed changes. This can be done in a group setting. You can do it one-on-one. There are pros and cons to each. As long as you're behaving appropriately and as long as you're not doing anything like offensive, rude, or kind of a bit silly, which way you go just depends a little bit on the relationship you have with your employees and the way that they're used to being communicated with. When you notify, you need to supply them with the business case, what the potential outcomes are, which is likely to include, well, if that's likely to include redundancy, you need to say that. Give them some timelines to go through, remind them that they have a right to seek advice on the process, and invite them to a response meeting to hear their feedback. Which brings us to your response meeting. So this is your employee's chance to provide a response to you about the proposed changes. They might say, yep, I agree, I don't have anything to add. I know we've been losing money for a period of time now. I'm kind of prepared for the chips to fall where they may. Or the longest response I ever got was a 15-page counter proposal, which had costings, it had market research. It was an incredibly thorough piece of work. It made a little bit of difference to the final outcome, but not a lot. So you could get anything from nothing to add through to kind of masses of response documents. You now must listen to and consider their feedback. You obviously don't have to agree. That would be incredibly onerous and making change really difficult. But you do have to listen to it, ask questions if you have any, and then if you need to make changes to your original proposal. You might not, probably what would I say, maybe 60 to 70% of restructures that we see don't end up having changes made, but that leaves about a third where something is slightly different. Maybe it's this set of work goes over here, maybe it's a proposal to go to 30 hours a week, changes to 35 hours a week. So they're not often super significant, but sometimes there are changes made. And of course, if you're not making any changes, you need to be able to explain and respond to their feedback or their counter proposal and explain why it wasn't adopted or why it doesn't make sense. So here we're confirming outcomes, right? So confirm the outcome of the restructure. If you have people who are losing their jobs, I would recommend doing that one-on-one so they can find out in a more private setting before you confirm to a group. Summarize and share feedback, which might include your response to the feedback you received or to any counter proposals. Explain any changes to the original proposal if those changes are material. Confirm if there are new positions in the structure, which ones are open for anyone to apply for, which ones are protected for people whose jobs are very similar, or any positions which are so similar that they must be offered to people within your business before being put out for application from others. And confirm the time frame for expressions of interest in those new roles, what the selection process will be, what the timeframes are, and so on. Lastly, we're confirming the impact. So the outcomes of expressions of interest for the available roles, again, whether they're open, protected, or non-contestable, communicate individually and then broadly. So if Sylvie's picking up this role, so-and-so has decided to take voluntary redundancy and so on. Confirm notice periods, if any, and when people might expect to wrap up. Issue new employment documentation, and then you are pretty much done. So common mistakes, of course, things to flag if you're considering going through this process. The first thing is to jump to consultation without testing or even really having a commercial justification. Again, you need to know and be able to explain to your employees what the changes are, why you're making them, and what you hope the impact will be. So spending a bit of time at the start of the process getting that business case right will absolutely save you headaches and frustration later down the line. So anything where you move too quickly and don't do enough pre-work will hold up the process later. The most common example of this tends to be when businesses go, I don't want to do a full business case. That's a real fucking hassle. I kind of can't be bothered. I'm just going to lay out the changes I'm proposing and why. And then when they get to the response meetings, their employees not unreasonably are going, I couldn't write a response to this. I haven't seen the costings. I haven't seen the strategy document you reference. I need more information to be able to give you feedback. And the employer, if they want to do the legally correct thing, now has to provide all that information, which then just delays the process because the clock starts again on your employee's consideration period. So do the work at the start, don't let it slow you up, and put the time in at the beginning to front load the work. This is something I see a little bit where you have job descriptions for your employees that don't match what they actually do. It can be very confusing and slow to go, well, Sylvie's JD says that she is a receptionist. She also actually does a bunch of accounts receivable work that isn't captured in her JD. So we need to figure out a way to figure out what it is that she does and then figure out how it is that we consult with her. So make sure your paperwork is up to scratch. Again, build it into your business processes. So if you do need to restructure, you're not spending time here. If you move to hire too quickly and have to restructure that person, that's pretty self-explanatory. If you're having cash flow problems, be a bit judicious about your hiring. Again, providing your employees insufficient information about what's driving the restructure will slow you down. If you don't use fair and reasonable criteria to decide who stays and who goes, that can lead to PGs. Dealing with selection criteria is almost like a whole separate session. So if you need to get some advice, I would recommend that you do that here, but make sure that you're being fair and reasonable. If you get the tone of communications wrong, if you're too gloomy or too chirpy, that can really change the tone of the experience. If you don't give your employees meaningful amounts of time to get advice or prepare a response, that can create risk for the business later. Failing to consult with everyone, of course, is an error that you will need to be mindful of. And if you are managing performance by stealth, where you've got a dickhead who you want to move on, so you're going to restructure their role, will absolutely land you in hot water. Deal with that through a performance management process rather than through restructuring. So a final word on survivor management, then we will jump into questions. So we're doing quite well for time. So survivor management is all about managing and attending to the people who are left behind by these changes. So if you have a bunch of people who've just seen their colleagues get made redundant, that's a pretty shit, uncomfortable experience for them to go through. So the sooner you can pay some attention to and provide some support for people who are left behind, the better the impact of those people will make in your business, the sooner you can kind of move on and leave this behind you. So to anyone who's not affected by the restructure, communicate often and proactively while the process is ongoing. Make sure you're giving them updates about what's happening. You're welcome to share the proposal with them too. There's nothing wrong with that, so that they can see what's happening, and make yourself available to answer any questions they have, or to speak to those employees who aren't affected. To make sure you name the ugly. Like, this is a really stressful process to go through for everyone, managers, business owners, and employees included. So where you can, name that it's going to be difficult and stressful. Offer support if you can. This might be EAP if you've got EAP services. It might be time away from work, paid or unpaid, to consider the restructure and to kind of manage things. And again, make sure that your management is available to support anyone who's finding this a bit difficult, again, just to be nearby and to help steady the ship. Where you can, make sure you're wrapping support around any new roles or teams. This might be some team building, some coaching, regular check-ins, and so on. Put some mechanisms in place for employee feedback. Like, you are about to have a different structure with different roles and different people in the business. So give yourself some time to make sure that those people in those roles are being successful, but also get employee feedback. Is this change saving as much time on the factory floor as we had expected? Are there any hiccups in embedding this new accounting process that we weren't aware of before? So make sure that you have the time to listen to and consider feedback and pick up on any issues before they get escalated or overblown. And address uncertainties where possible. So say we don't know how this is going to pan out. Just be really honest about it. No one ever really resents transparent communication, but they certainly will resent overconfident or misleading communications where just being honest about what's in front of you might have been easier. And lastly, take some time to celebrate the wins. So where you have successes and milestones related to the restructure, celebrate them. Take the time to do that. Maybe that's a team dinner a few months afterwards. If you've restructured to save on costs and it's having that effect, celebrate that. Share that information with your team. One, so that they know their stress hasn't been for nothing, but two, to show that the business has made good decisions about your stewardship of your resources, your finances, and your people, so that the business continues to operate and continues to be in a healthy state going forward. So we come to questions. I have had a couple come through, but I will stop sharing my screen shortly, just so that I can answer those with a bit more detail. Bear with me. Cool. So question from Anonymous. Kia ora, Anonymous. Thank you for coming along. We want to create a new full-time role in the business and disestablish a current part-time role. There will be around 30% of the old role that will be taken on by the new role. Can we essentially complete a restructure, or do we have to offer the new role to the existing employee, even though we know they do not have the skills to do the new role? That's a really good question. The fact that there's only going to be about 30% of the old role being taken on by the new role says to me that the new role is different enough that you don't have that obligation to redeploy. So I would go through a restructure process as you've suggested, consult to make the changes. But then as a part of that process, when you're proposing the change, I would be sharing with the employee a job description and potentially a selection matrix to show what the skills and competencies are you would be looking for in order to staff the new role. Say that they would be welcome to apply for it. However, in your assessment, it's different enough and their skills are different enough that they wouldn't be successful if they did apply. If they do apply, consider them, but then you can say, I'm sorry, we're not going to offer the role to you, and make sure you've taken care of all of that before it is that you recruit and then go to market for that role. So the short answer is no, you don't have to offer the role to your incumbent, even though some of their work is going to the new role. It's different enough that you don't have to do that. Cool. Question from Anne. Kia ora, Anne. Thanks for coming along. How open do you think employers should be with the finances? For example, I have some people who just want to give a blurb about why they need to save money without showing any financial data. Where do you think the sweet spot is? That's an excellent question, and it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string piece. So I wouldn't recommend sharing your profit and loss statement with your employees. For one, it's more likely to confuse them than it is to help them understand what's going on. Many people who aren't in finance or aren't in management don't have the financial context to understand a P&L, which is fine. But certainly be sharing information about the financial drivers that are affecting this. So if your costs have increased as a percentage of your revenue, share what that percentage increase has been. If your gross profit margin has dropped for whatever reason, kind of explain the drivers and provide some numbers to support that. What is the art of writing a compelling business case is sharing the right amount of information, the sweet spot, as you've said, which supports the story that you're telling, but launching your financial reporting for the last 2 quarters into your employees' hands is not going to be helpful. So make sure it supports the story that you're telling, be judicious in your use of finances. There isn't really a hard and fast answer, unfortunately, but more tends to be better, and make sure that you're telling a story which is supported by the finances that you have. Anonymous asks, how does AI fit into all of this? Say you started adopting AI tech or innovations over a period of time. This might be software which takes menial tasks off business support staff, which results in their workload decreasing. How do you reasonably give notice about the change when adopting new tech and innovations, which might take work off them and lead to a reduced headcount in the future? That's an excellent question. The short answer is you don't have to. So there is an expectation that over time, work changes, and over time, the systems and processes we use to manage all of that at work are going to improve and be supported by new technology. So if it's a gradual change over time, you kind of don't need to consult until you get to a point where clearly you are over-resourced or clearly something has to change. That obligation to consult is more about if you were to bring in a new accounting system which halved the need for your accounts receivable team. Or if you were going to bring in a new ice cream maker, which doubled the amount of ice cream you could output over the course of 24 hours and needed half as many people to run it. Those kinds of changes do require consultation before because they're quite acute and quite specific. Changes over time, I wouldn't worry about. Anonymous asks, can we share a link to a MyHR blog about the fair and reasonable criteria? We might need to reduce the number of people in the same role from 2 down to 1. Yeah, we sure can. What I'll do is for our marketing team, when they send out the follow-up email to this webinar later, I'll ask them to include a link to the blog resources that we have here. Again, if you're a MyHR client, all of this kind of support is accessible to you through your monthly fee. So give the team a call if you have something specific to talk about. But yes, I'll make sure a link is included in that follow-up email. That's a good prompt. Thank you. We've got 2 more questions here, and then we will wrap up. So anything else, please jump it in now. We are part of a global, Anonymous asks, we are part of a global company and potentially disestablishing a tech role here locally and offshoring to India. If the employee who is from India expresses interest to move to India instead and take on a role there, will we be obligated to pay them the same rate as they're paid in New Zealand, or can we follow the rates in the India space? That's a good question. You are not obligated to pay someone the same rate in a role that's newly created or relocated. I think it would be totally unreasonable to expect to be paid the same amount of money for doing a role in New Zealand, where our cost of living and our wages are a lot higher than in low-cost countries like India, Indonesia, parts of the Middle East, parts of South America, and so on. So if the role is going to be in India, it is fine to say this is a newly created role which is taking on those responsibilities. The pay rate is going to be X amount. The JD is going to look like XYZ, and this is what it's going to be paid. So no expectation or requirement to pay in India what they were earning in New Zealand. Cool. Last question here from Nicola. Thank you, Nicola, for your question. We're in an electrical field. If we restructure and let go a couple of apprentices, how long do you need to wait before, if we get busy again, to employ an apprentice again? So basically, if you restructure a couple of roles or our role, how long before you need to recruit again? So this is, there isn't a black and white answer to that question. You do have a 90-day personal grievance window that you want to be outside of before you offer the role to someone else. So if you recruit within 90 days of restructuring someone and making them redundant, my recommendation would be to reach out and say, hey, our circumstances have changed. We now have a vacancy for an apprentice again, or for a receptionist, or for whatever. Would you like the role? After 3 months, I would say there isn't an obligation to get in touch, and within the 90 days, that's more of a risk management kind of piece. So if there is anything that happens after 90 days, you can just go to market and enter the chips for where they may. Awesome. Thank you everyone for your questions. We're at 10 to 2, so I'm giving you a little bit of time back in your day. Again, slides and a recording will follow in a couple of days' time. I hope you've enjoyed the session today. If you'd like to leave us some feedback, we're always keen to hear what you enjoyed and what you think we might do differently or better next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Any questions, get in touch, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one. So ka kite, and we'll talk to you soon.